Welcome to History Comes Alive, the podcast that takes you on a deep dive into a new historical topic every episode. Join us as we explore the nuances of historical events you probably didn't learn about in school. Here's your host, Jeff Nichols.
Welcome back. We made it through the Massasoit series, and I hope you found that beneficial. It certainly took us a long way toward understanding the immediate environment the Pilgrims found themselves in. In that series, we came in contact with the Wampanoags, the Massachusetts, the Nausets. We met the Narragansetts. We recognized that the Pilgrims were relatively friendly with the natives. We also came to understand that not all of the English were. In that series, we gained a much better understanding of men like William Bradford and Miles Standish and Squanto. We met others like Hobomok and Massasoit. These were fascinating men living in truly extraordinary times. And in my opinion, Massasoit was the linchpin. Now, that series represented our introduction to English colonialism. It was not the first time colonialism was tried. It was one of the first significant colonies that really took off. Its equivalent was Jamestown, and we'll eventually work our way down the coast and explore their humble beginnings as well. But for now, however, we want to continue to develop the colonial narrative of New England, lower New England, really. How the English came to dominate the landscape, not just in comparison to the natives, but to the Dutch first, and then ultimately the French. Plymouth had survived with the help of Massasoit, but they were not thriving as they had wanted to. They had been unable to really develop the trade relationships that were necessary to make money and flourish. They were the big show for the English in this region, and it was not really a very big show. They paled in comparison to their Dutch counterparts as far as making money. I mean, that's what the Dutch were really after. To really strike it rich, you have to have a product or a service that people want. You also have to have the ability to transport and deliver that product or service. You need supply lines. You need supplies. If your customer does not have what you want, then you have to find one that does and begin to organize trade to the extent that all parties feel compensated and enriched. The supplies must meet demand. If long-term success and profits are to be sustained, there has to be a recognized currency, some way to measure the value of the commodities or services being offered and received by the various parties. Well, the Europeans had minted money in Europe. They only had so much in New England. This was a time before electronic banking and large-scale banking of any kind in the New World. The idea of European currency having any real value with the natives is almost silly. Theirs was a different kind of economy. It would require different kinds of currency. With all the various tribes and European players, English, French, Dutch, along the northern coast and inlands, effective wealth-building currency had to have an almost universal appeal. Its supplies must be enough to accommodate trade with many people and yet not so easy to obtain that everybody could produce their own. And conversely, products that were purchased by this currency would have more value if everybody was not equally able to acquire those. One thing's for sure, there was one commodity that almost all of Europe was demanding: furs, pelts. Beaver was the big one. Hats were a big deal in Europe, among other things. Furs were in high demand with few suppliers. We're going to develop that scenario in a later series, but for now, we want to understand the currency of the times. A currency with mass appeal among the natives, a currency that could be used to purchase furs that would be transported back to a very hungry European market. Now, over the next 2 weeks or so, we'll define and develop the concept of the currency. Then the next several episodes, multiple episodes, we haven't put a number on that yet, will revolve around how the development and exploitation of this currency resulted in the rise and the fall of many men, the rise and the fall of many nations. In comparison to our previous series on Massasoit, this currency had a similar towering influence over the English ability to gain a foothold and expand until eventually they reigned supreme. Yes, the local currency provided both the ambition and the means. And as we'll see, it truly was the catalyst to the rise and the fall of many nations. I'm speaking of wampum, shell money. It's worth fleshing this out a little bit. Like so many innovative type products that burst onto the scene, there was a time of preparation before the frenzy, a time of preparation that could only be realized in hindsight. And that's the time that we want to focus on. That's where we want to start, the time of preparation. So at the dawn of European colonization, which caused cataclysmic changes in the native landscape, there were already changes taking place among the native tribes. Did the Europeans exacerbate the trends? Yes. Were they, at least in part, to blame? Yes. But they do not bear sole responsibility. It's important to make a note of what the cultural, societal landscape looked like before and just after the Europeans arrived, long before the exploitation of shell money. The various native tribes in the New England coastal region, as well as the immediate interior, had experienced many different changes. The landscape was shifting and adjusting to situations both within and beyond their control. To begin with, probably as far back as the 1400s, maize agriculture and growing populations encouraged long-range trade. Maize could be stored. It was durable. It could be dried and rehydrated. It was easily transportable. The wampum producers began to trade with those tribes in the interior. The wampum was often transported farther inland through intermediary tribes located kind of in between the other folks. These were developing trade networks that produced a more consolidated power base as powerful men arose to organize and control their piece of the action. Not organize it necessarily, protect it. That took skill. It took business prowess. It took men for security and to project strength. And again, it started in the 1400s. As the Europeans began to arrive a few hundred years later, they greatly stressed these trade arrangements. At the time, and just prior of European arrival, there was an environmental impact upon the land. There was a cold period so radical that it's been called a little ice age. With this cold period, growing seasons were shortened. Rainfall and wind patterns were disrupted. Drought ensued. Food became harder and harder to produce. It may have been the worst weather in almost a millennia. This upheaval produced refugees and consolidation of villages. It produced leaders with a great deal more power than traditionally may have occurred. New leaders and new lineages of leadership. Generational leadership of merged peoples. And the Europeans often relied on the natives in those early years for their food as well, stressing even farther that food supply. Think about just these two situations and add the arrival of the Europeans. First, there was the disease that they brought. That killed off some folks, a lot of folks. That led to more consolidation of people, territory, power, alliances. Then, add the introduction of European goods, clothing, metals, tools, guns, and the competition to control these commodities along the established trade routes and brokers. But there was more money to be made now, more than ever before. High risk, high reward, or maybe just the ability to survive. Remember, we've talked about how much their world was changing. I mean, can't you feel the anxiety? And the Pilgrims and then the Puritans thought their society was doomed. How do you think the natives felt? Also, traditionally, it is believed smaller groups or villages would make decisions through consensus, and the leaders were more negotiators within the group. But the Europeans brought a different form of leadership. They expected to deal with a decision maker, and again, another catalyst to a more consolidated power base. The bigger villages or groups had more collective power. They had more security. Thus, many joined together. They might have been stronger or better equipped to compete, but they were now less autonomous. These emerging groups began to negotiate and compete amongst themselves. Competition grew, especially with those closest to your group, or those closest to the European trading posts. The arrival of the Europeans did not start a lot of this consolidation, but it's easy to see how it quickly increased both velocity and volume with the newcomers. The native groups were emerging with known reputations, skills, talents that they each lended to the process. One of the most interesting to me is the brokers, these guys that managed to negotiate on behalf of others and arrange the transactions and terms between groups. I mean, people are people and business is business. There's something to be said for the individual accumulation of wealth. The natives didn't originally have too big an issue in this regard. I mean, at least that's my impression. They weren't really looking for amassing large personal wealth. I mean, later they would to a little more of a degree, but those that did acquire personal wealth usually ended up giving that over to the sachem or to the powwow anyways. But communal reputation was recognized. Now, for our example, I want to talk about just two groups of middlemen very quickly to help develop this concept a little bit. The first group is the Susquehannocks. Now, apparently, these guys moved almost 200 miles away from their original area in the mid-1500s. So that'd be just before the Europeans arrived, toward the centers of trade between the natives. They did not relocate in several villages as they had existed before the move, but rather built a single large defensible town. They were already trading intermediaries when the Europeans arrived. They merely added the European goods to their mix. And the second group that I want to talk about are the Ottawa. And their name literally means traders. They were originally on the East Coast, eastern Ontario on the Ottawa River and western Quebec. They were intertribal traders. Ultimately, they moved to the Ohio, Michigan, southern Canada area, like around Detroit, intentionally for trade, in part with the English and then also with the French. They battled the Iroquois, the Dakota, and the Wyandots, and they were instrumental in French fur trade. Their best-known leader was Opondiac, or as we say in English, Pontiac. In fact, their first encounter with the Europeans was in 1615 with Samuel de Champlain. Champlain said, quote, "Their arms consisted of only a bow and arrows, a buckler of boiled leather, and a club. They wore no breechclouts. Their bodies were tattooed in many fashions and designs, their faces painted and their noses pierced." But we're going to talk more about these guys in later episodes. For now, let's get back to the main story of wampum. So on the backdrop of all of this, over the prior 2 centuries of native activity, the Europeans arrived. It's important to realize that the plagues and the diseases that arrived with them did not evenly and uniformly descend upon the native population. The coastal guys and the first encounter folks were hit first. Their lands and their people were decimated. Now, the Wampanoags were one of those people in the years just prior to the Pilgrims arriving. Their rivals just to the west, the Narragansetts, along with their rivals just to their west, the Pequots, right along that Long Island Sound area in Connecticut, they wouldn't suffer those debilitating losses until the 1630s when intermingling with the Europeans really took off. And these guys were in another cycle of consolidation. The Narragansetts and the Pequots wanted to take full advantage of the opportunities that presented themselves. And here's where the root of the upcoming conflict, or I should say the upcoming conflicts, plural, begins for our extended series. The Pequots were the real power brokers in the opening years. But by the end, they wouldn't even exist. We'll be taking several swipes at this situation. Again, think like the encyclopedia transparencies of those big, heavy books when we were younger, building on the layers of human anatomy. You know, you had the skeletal, and then you put the other transparency over it, and you built the muscular system, and then the circulatory, and then the skin. But to set the stage in short order, the Narragansetts and the Pequots were the controllers and the overseers of the production of wampum. Before the Europeans, the 2 tribes enjoyed relatively good relations, but that would change. Roger Williams said the Narragansetts were the mint masters of wampum. I mean, of course, he lived among them. He should say that. Much like the Wampanoags with the Pilgrims, so the Narragansetts were generous with Roger Williams. Anyway, they did trade in a 600-mile radius. Not bad for those times. They traded with the Dutch, the French, the English, and other native tribes. They competed with the Pequots. The best wampum was produced south of Cape Cod and along both shores of the Long Island Sound, the land of the Pequots and the Narragansetts. Here's how wampum became the currency of the New World. Well, New England, for our current narrative. In 1622, Joques Elekes, a Dutchman, visited a Pequot village. This is the same time frame as the Wessagosset fiasco was going on the Cape. So Joques Elekes, a Dutchman, visited a Pequot village at the mouth of the Thames River in Connecticut. It did not go well. Elekes did not like the way the Pequots dealt with him. So what was he to do? He kidnapped the chief, and he threatened to decapitate him if he was not paid. The Pequots obliged. They paid Joques Elekes 40 fathoms of an odd little item he said were, quote, small beads which they manufacture themselves and prize as jewels, end quote. Now, I'm glad to report Joques Elekes accepted the beads. Little did anyone know that ransom marked the beginning of the end for the mighty Pequots. In 15 years, they'd be gone. But what a 15 years it was going to be. It's going to be a great story for us, I promise. What Elekes soon realized was that other natives would trade furs for those beads. So here we have the first European encounter with wampum. Well, the first European encounter with wampum that really matters. The first European encounter with wampum of any consequence. So we've set the stage. Life as everybody knew it was changing. It was the end of the world as they knew it. Environment, trade, Europeans, exploitation of a common currency. Nailed it. What was it? I mean, just exactly what was wampum? Beads? Shells? What? I mean, literally, the word wampum means strings of white shell beads. So I said it was shell money. What it was small, tubular-shaped shells, beads from shells, that had to be harvested and crafted. They were actually two species of whelk, sea snails, large predatory sea snails, the kind that you think of when you think of seashells. So there was the Bisicon circa, or the knobbed whelk. These were the larger of the two species. They grew to be about 12 inches. That's pretty good sized. These are the cone-shaped shells, spiral shells with spines on the shoulders. Then you've got the Bisicotopus, canaliculitus, formerly Bisicon canaliculitum. Okay, so I'm no marine biologist. Channeled whelk. They look like Aladdin's lamp to me. Now, they were a little bit smaller, 5 to 8 inches. They're pearl-shaped shells with a straight spherical canal. These two species like shallow, sandy beaches. And there was also the more valuable purple or blue-black beads produced by removing a colored spot on the hard shell of a clam, the mercenaria. So there were white and dark beads, and the dark carried more value because they were, less in number. They could be up to twice as valuable as the white beads. There were a few sources I saw that made mentions of periwinkle snails, but I wasn't sold on that. One source reported that it was of a European origin, and it really wasn't found on the eastern coast of North America until the 1870s. So I'm going to go with the knobbed and the channeled whelk. Although the reports of the shells were that it was found only south of Cape Cod, I think that must have meant for that region, because these shells, the snails, can be found basically from Cape Cod to Florida. The knobbed whelk is actually the state seashell of both Georgia and New Jersey. I mean, go figure, who knew? I didn't even know states had state seashells. But what we want to recognize is that natives up and down the coastline celebrated and used shell beads in similar fashions. Now, the process for production was long and arduous. So a limited source that required skilled labor for production. I mean, they would spend the summers collecting the shells and then the winters producing the beads. The process went something like this. They would cut the shells into cylinders or tubes, a 1/4 inch long and 1/8 of an inch in diameter. Now stop right there for a second. If you're thinking about what it would be like to cut these shells, these cylinders, or these tubes into 1/4 inch long by 1/8 inch diameter pieces, think about doing that without modern technology and tools. Then they would smooth and they would polish the shells. And then they would bore the shell out. Basically, they'd drill it lengthwise. Again, think about that without modern tools. And then they would string the finished product on strings of animal gut or hemp. So to me, the whole process sounds pretty amazing. The natives called it wampum peage, or just peage. It would be strung into lengths of 1 fathom. That's what they called it, about 6 feet. And each string would consist of 240 to 360 beads, depending on the size. And again, think about that, not in terms of modern manufacturing or the modern marvels of technology of machinery or even hand tools, but think about the tools and the situation that they would have found themselves in. How long would it take to produce one of these beads, let alone 240 to 360 to fill up just 1 fathom? And how many fathoms did they give to Joques Elekes? 40 fathoms. So then they would combine strands to be 1 to 5 inches wide. And these would be worn on the wrist or the waist or even over the shoulder. And some of these belts got quite big. Some contained over 10,000 beads. And they were used for a variety of things. I mean, they had, monetary value. A fathom was worth 5 shillings or 60 pence. And I believe that's about 3 days' wages for the times. Now, some of the numbers vary slightly. I mean, when you're reading these older records and accounts, sometimes it's a matter of variation. It depends on who recorded what at what time. So that said, I want to read a quote from the late 19th, early 20th century Tuscaroran linguist and ethnographer John Napoleon Britton Hewitt, who said this on the production of wampum. Quote, "The process, though simple, required a skill acquired only by long practice. The intense hardness and brittleness of the materials made it impossible to wear, grind, and bore the shell by machinery alone. First, the thin portions were removed with a light, sharp hammer, and the remainder was clamped in a scissor sawed in a slender stick, and was then ground into an octagonal figure, 1 inch in length and 1/2 inch in diameter. This piece, being ready for boring, was inserted into another piece of wood, sawed like the first stick, which was firmly fastened to a bench, a weight being so adjusted that it caused the scissor to grip the shell and to hold it securely. The drill was made from an untempered handsaw, ground into proper shape, and tempered into the flame of a candle, braced against a steel plate on the operator's chest and nicely adjusted to the center of the shell. The drill was rotated by means of a common hand bow. To clean the aperture, the drill was dexterously withdrawn while in motion and was cleared by the thumb and finger of the particles of shell. From a vessel hanging over the closely clamped shell, drops of water fell on the drill to cool it. For particular care was exercised lest the shell break from the heat caused by friction." End quote. The point is, despite some minor discrepancies over the various numbers of beads or whatever, that sounds like a lot of work. Before the Europeans arrived, there's ample evidence that these beads were drilled out with stone tools. Think about that. Whew. That's a tedious and dedicated craft. Well, from this localized area of South Cape Cod and the Long Island Sound, wampum spread. You remember the trade routes that had been developing? Well, wampum had a variety of uses. It's tough to name them all, and our point isn't to get too deep in the weeds with every detail. Our goal is to demonstrate just how much this wampum was celebrated and used by virtually every native. Societally, it was used to settle debt. It was used for religious ceremony. It was used as bridal gifts. Wampum was used by the lesser sachems to pay the more powerful, and this tribute would enrich the powerful, but also buy their protection. Again, there's an easing into consolidation going on here. They would redeem captives. That's probably why the Pequots offered Joques Elekes wampum. I mean, that was a natural reaction for the natives. Plus, I mean, the Pequots had lots of it. From a judicious or legal standpoint, wampum was used to satisfy murders and other wrongs among the people. It purchased peace. It settled blood feuds. Sachems would levy fines in wampum for fighting and for spilling of blood. It solidified treaties. One European observer of the times wrote that it was used as a precious currency akin to gold and silver. Politically, often the man with the most wampum was chosen as sachem. So I guess, frankly, not a lot has changed since then. The guy with the most money ends up being in charge. Even intertribally, it was even used at large gatherings where the men from various tribes engaged in sporting events. These were serious events that often attracted hundreds of people and were carried out in place of actual combat. The contestants were very serious, and often wampum went to the winner. Wampum was easier to carry and transport than animals or crops. It could be carried long distances and exchanged through many hands to secure goods and services. As noted with the wide range of uses and acceptance, wampum was popular everywhere. One issue always had been that it was time-consuming to produce. I mean, it really limited its availability. But with the arrival of European tools, mass production was possible. Well, masser production than what had been. It also took on a fundamentally increased role as currency. Remember, the first Europeans in the area were more focused on trade and not permanent settlement. The furs were plentiful closer to the coast, but as the furs became scarcer and the competition grew, they were forced to look farther inland to deal with other groups. And again, like livestock and crops, European finished goods were difficult to carry too far. The immediate natives around a European settlement were only going to need so many pots and pans and tools. Thus, the Europeans found it difficult to actually find anything of value that interested the natives, until wampum. You can already see how this is going to mushroom, and with it, unfortunately, all of the downsides as well, including counterfeit wampum, which the natives recognized right away, but the Europeans did not. Thus, the value could be driven down, flooding the market. Doesn't it really sound like a real economy? I mean, real thought, real organization, real competition, real development, and again, real problems. All these things would come in their time. So it was, when Joques Elekes accepted the Pequot wampum, so many things were not necessarily set in motion, well, not from a standstill, but so many things were accelerated. And as we've said a few minutes ago, Joques Elekes soon realized the value the natives placed on the bead money. The Dutch were in Connecticut and soon in the mid-Atlantic, as we've already discussed on a previous episode. But they were really focused on that corridor between modern New York City and Albany, along the modern Hudson River. So Elekes and his Dutch countrymen would open the door to full-fledged exploitation of the wampum trade. There was a lot of money that was going to be made, and along with these opportunities came all of the predictable benefits and drawbacks. Wampum would ultimately provoke the rise and fall of many. Combined with the fur trade, it broke the system. And now our stage is set. We'll pick up our story next week as we look at what happened after Joques Elekes figured out what he had stumbled upon, how the currency proliferated throughout the Northeast of the U.S. and southeast of Canada, and throughout the Great Lakes region. It's fascinating, ingenious, wealth-building for many, destructive for many more. The root of all kinds of evil, of which our generation is still benefiting. Make no mistake, this wampum would, in part, prove to be the downfall of the Dutch experience in North America, as well as many of the native tribes. But that's for next time. I hope that this time has really helped the history to come alive.
Thanks for listening to History Comes Alive. We hope today's episode has given you valuable new information and inspired you to dive even deeper. Don't forget to check out Jeff's website, historywithjeff.com, and engage with Jeff across all your favorite social media platforms at History with Jeff. Join us next time as more history comes alive.